Good morning, welcome to Monday morning's thought for today, bank holiday Monday morning. Maybe you're not in your usual routine this morning and you have maybe watched this a bit later on in the day, but hopefully it's still relevant for you. What we're doing this week is we're looking really at Mark chapter 7 and the first 23 verses really of that chapter that we looked at yesterday morning in church. And I really want to just pick a few things out that I didn't have time to mention, or that maybe were on your mind, or maybe something that you didn't even think about, and give you some sort of enlightenment, if possible, on a Monday morning. We want to think really this morning about this whole issue that seemed to have kicked off this discussion with Jesus and the Pharisees, and also some of the scribes who were there. We don't know why they were there. We don't know what their idea was. We know that they had come down to where Jesus was, and maybe they were just coming to listen to him. Maybe they were trying to set a trap. Maybe they were genuinely searching. We don't know. But they had been watching Jesus, and they'd also been watching his disciples to see what they were doing. And as rabbis would watch rabbis, they were keeping an eye to see if Jesus was doing anything he shouldn't have been doing. And they caught him out quite obviously, because the disciples weren't washing their hands before they were eating their food. Now, we know all about washing our hands in this country, don't we? Little did we think that just over a year ago we would be washing our hands quite as much, or using those sanitizers, etc., those sprays, going into shops, all those things we have to do now as part of daily life, or we should be doing, because it is important. Those were the similar sort of thing that was going on really in Jesus' time. It had nothing to do with the coronavirus. A lot of it had to do with the fact that if somebody touched something they shouldn't have, and somebody else had touched it and they hadn't been clean, then you made yourself unclean by touching it and by eating food with unclean hands. That was against the tradition of the elders, as we thought about yesterday morning. This extra layer that was put on top of what God had commanded. In fact, in many ways, it was put on top of what God had commanded, and what God had commanded had been forgotten. And the tradition of the elders, or this oral tradition, was something which was more important in a sense. And so there's this idea that if you touch something that somebody who was unclean had touched, then you yourself became unclean. Now, you could become unclean through a whole lot of ways. A lot of it had to do with if somebody had some sort of forgive me if you're eating your breakfast and watching this, but some sort of bodily excretion in any shape or form, that made anything they touched unclean. And if you happen to touch them or something they had touched, because it does remind us in this passage that bowls and utensils and things are all tied up in this. If you touched anything that they had touched, in much the same way, I suppose, as the coronavirus could be passed on, or so we believe, from one thing someone touched to somebody else, so uncleanliness could be passed on to you. Therefore, it was very important that you had to come, and before you ate your food, that you had to be ritually clean. You weren't allowed to come unclean. But they noticed the disciples of Jesus weren't doing this. Jesus' disciples were just simply getting on with it. Washing their hands wasn't something that was terribly important to them. Now, obviously, you could argue from a hygiene point of view, it should have been. But from a ritualistic point of view, it wasn't, because Jesus had taught them properly. But this whole issue of the hygiene isn't actually an issue at all. We tend to think that they washed their hands because of hygiene purposes. They didn't want to bring anything that somebody else might have given them to their food as they were eating it. But in actual fact, it had very little to do with hygiene. It was basically they didn't want to, I suppose you could say, almost incriminate themselves in the wrong that somebody else had done. The uncleanliness from somebody else could be passed on to them. They would be called unclean. They wouldn't be able to eat their food. They wouldn't be able to be part of society, etc., until they'd gone through whatever cleansing that had to be. And I was trying to think of some of the parallels that we have in this life about how we sometimes, obviously with coronavirus, we keep our distance from people. We be careful when we don't shake hands. In fact, I can't remember the last time I shook someone's hand. We don't do the sort of things we used to do in the same way as we used to do them. And there's that sense that we keep our distance, and we watch because we don't want to get something that somebody has given us. But there's another way, I think, which in some ways we are very like the Pharisees and the scribes in Mark chapter 7. For example, there are times as human beings, if we, for example, in a work situation, if somebody is under suspicion for doing something, and maybe management are looking into it, or they're being investigated by the police or whatever, very often as human beings, we keep our distance from that person. Even for example, for somebody who's maybe been sacked, we don't want to be seen with them. We don't want to be seen talking to them. We don't want anyone to know that we called at their house or anything, just in case whatever they did somehow sticks to us as well. The mud that was slung at them maybe falls and sticks to us as well. That there's a sense that we don't want to be incriminated with somebody else. And sometimes that manifests itself in us not showing somebody support, or in us distancing ourselves from somebody we called a friend, maybe even a relative. And so we need to be careful that this sense within us that we need to be careful that we don't necessarily judge somebody until they've been properly judged, or we show them mercy when they need to be shown mercy, instead of worrying about how we look or what people will think of us if we speak to them. So there's a whole issue that wrapped up in this whole uncleanliness thing that maybe we need to think about in our own lives. Have we labelled somebody unclean? Would we worry about somebody talking about us if they saw us talking to somebody else who was called unclean? And so while we're not talking about hygiene, we are talking about this sense of being seen to do the right thing. The fear of man, we thought about that a couple of weeks ago. Such a powerful thing. And in some ways it can destroy relationships because we're scared of what people might think of us if we have anything to do with somebody else. Something to think about on a Monday morning. Hopefully we can understand this, but hopefully we also know the freedom that Christ brings to our lives, knowing that we follow God's word and not this other layer of tradition that's been laid down or had been laid down on top of what God had taught. I hope you have a good bank holiday Monday, and God willing, we'll see you again tomorrow. In the meantime, God bless.